Silber on May 4th, 1993 in Oakland.
3rd.
May 3rd, pardon me, 1993. Now we are set, and that is fine for all of us.
Oh, okay, good. Well, as I started to say, especially in the film, whoever does it will get some piece of the reality, and it'll also be colored by their own opinions, prejudices, who they spoke to last, and so on. That's inevitable. So I just gave up worrying about it.
Right.
That's actually nice to hear.
My first, yeah, that is actually, because there is a lot of, we've encountered a lot of feeling that, well, you just can't do it. You should, or you should do it.
Yeah, I know, but in part it's because it's in my past and not my present.
Right.
And, you know, a lot of people have been pressing me to write something about it, and when I get done with my present projects, maybe I will, I don't know.
Do you
But
have any desire to write anything about it, or is this your past?
I do to a certain extent, mostly because there are certain aspects of it which are not well understood, in my opinion, obviously. And certain things having to do with the political side of it that are the subject of a lot of rumor and gossip, but people really don't know what they're talking about. And a lot of that I know about it.
What are the aspects of it that you think are not well understood?
Well, there's a sort of mythology about the relationship between the revival and the communist movement. It takes different forms. One in particular, an old-fashioned view, sort of like, well, at some point in the 1930s, the communists decided to become more popular, and they turned to folk music. Well, it's not really the way it happened at all. What is true in the 1930s, the communists, you know, it was the United Front period and all that, and they wanted to reach out. They reached out to pop music. The folk music sort of came at the Communist Party and the left generally from people who were interested in folk music who happened to have a left album. But it's not like anybody in the Communist Party sat down and figured this out and said, oh, to be really American, we're going to get into folk music. They were heavy into jazz. The left-wing, when the communists first got interested in music, they did this old-fashioned German choral stuff, Hans Eisler, and you know, mass choruses and so on, which corresponded more or less to the largely immigrant character of the party, especially in New York. So, sure, they had a natural base for that. And then when they tried to reach out, and they especially wanted to reach out to blacks, they had big emphasis on that, they got interested in jazz. So the famous Spiritual Swing concert, Carnegie Hall, is run by New Masses, which is a communist magazine. And it's not until the Almanac Singers come along quite on their own that they begin to, you know, the party begins to wake up to this kind of stuff. Anyway, then there's a whole bunch of stuff about how people's songs got started and people's artists sing out, and its relationship to the communist movement, which, you know, I'm probably the only one who knows about.
Yeah, sure.
Let me ask
I
you
mean,
this.
of all the people who are still living, a couple of...
Let me ask you this, taking off on those thoughts you just expressed, there is nonetheless an identification in people's minds between folk music and leftist politics.
Oh, of course.
It did not develop between, say, jazz and leftist politics. Why did folk music, the identification of folk music with the left kind of last when the party used other popular forms as well? Why did the leftist connection, you know, glom onto jazz and stick with that, or choral music? Why folk music?
Well, I think one of the reasons is the parties, it's a kind of a literalism in politics. So the word is very important. It's not terribly important in jazz.
Right. Okay.
And I think that's a fairly big factor. Then part of the appeal of the folk music was it had a big participatory quality, which jazz doesn't. I mean, the audience is fairly passive. Like, sometimes they don't look passive, but I mean, it's a listening audience. But then you got Pete Seeger coming along, and he's got 1 million people singing, much more than the old mass choruses could, right? And so there's that sense of participation, and it's easy. Jazz, you need a band. folk music, I mean, it's a very practical thing. One person with a guitar or banjo, and they're like a small musical army, or they could be. So anyway, there's a lot of different practical factors aside from ideological ones. I mean, most of the people I know, including myself, in a sense, I prefer listening to jazz than to folk music. But I can see I mean, I like folk music. And although what we were into at first was not folk music, it was, political music to sort of folky sounding tunes, or things like that. But I think those are some of the elements that account for it.
We're focusing a little bit more on what is a really more restricted use of the term revival. We
In the
want
60s.
to look at what is really a commercial movement and talk about why that commercial movement sprang up and what its lasting effect was, or did it have a lasting effect? And I don't know that we have a point of view yet. And well, I think we believe it had a lasting effect, but I think we're willing to go a lot of different ways. Do you think there's a story in the 1963 folk scare that has any significance, any lasting cultural significance? So it's kind of a big question, but I'm wondering you.
Well, it's hard to isolate one element of the revival and say, did that have a particular significance? The whole revival did, but itself was also a reflection of larger processes at work in the transformation of American culture. I mean, the revival, even as a commercial phenomenon, began 10 years earlier, when the Weavers came along. Before that, the commercial aspect was more in the South, where traditional performers began to be able to make a living and develop more and more along the lines of what we call country music. But, the old original Carter family and people like that, they come right out of that grassroots, as do a lot of the country musicians. But in terms of national, popular, mass appeal, the Weavers were the ones that kicked it off. And if it wasn't for McCarthyism and the blacklist, the revival would have begun 10 years ago. It did begin, but it was aborted.
Right.
It was aborted. Okay. So that's one thing. The 60s, the great impact of the revival, of course, was that it intersected with two phenomenal mass phenomena, the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. Or the anti-war movement came along somewhat afterwards, but it built on it, and they're all part of that same process. And again, I think a lot has to do with the emphasis on words. One of the problems with as a lot of the folk musicians moved toward rock is that the words became less important. And there was not as much emphasis on ideas as on broad feelings, which, that's okay, it's part of the nature of the times. It's a kind of an existential process, but something was lost, I feel, that occurred in the early 60s when the political outlook of the folk revival was much more explicit. And then after that, it became implicit. I mean, so even when the Beatles were political, give peace a chance, and they were very broad, general kinds of statements, and the statement came more out of the way in which things were done, sort of the challenge to authority, the circumstances under which songs were done. I mean, rock was a challenge to authority too, but it wasn't as overtly political. Yeah, somebody's having some work done in the park.
Cutting trees.
Let's hope not.
What parameters, what dateline parameters are in your mind? You use the term revival, which you've thrown out a few times yourself, and I've thrown it back at you. What do you think of as the period of the revival?
Well, it's too big a word.
Okay.
One has to kind of situate it. The term revival, in a sense, actually comes from England. But they had a big folk revival that Ewan McCall either took responsibility for or credit or was blamed for, or depending on your point of view. Probably a combination of all three. And there it was revival in a very literal sense, in which the traditional songs really got revived, and a whole generation of singers grew up singing these traditional songs. Some of them sang overtly political stuff, but they maintained the distinction between the two. They would often use the tunes, but they were very conscious of when they were singing the traditional things. And a lot of this was Ewan and to a certain extent A.L. Lloyd, who emphasized the fidelity to tradition, not just in sort of singing the same words and tune, but in performance style and things like that. They were rigorous taskmasters, and they whipped the asses of a whole generation of aspiring British folk singers and produced some great things. Of course, Irwin was a great artist, so he taught as much by example as by instruction. In the United States, the first Lomax engaged in a sort of a revival and was roundly criticized by the Academy because he took a kind of popularizing approach to what he was doing, his research and so on. And John Lomax, the elder, was not above tinkering with the songs to make them come off better or, things like that. And horrified the sort of, traditional scholars, although he did incredible work. And he also was a groundbreaker in the sense that there was a large school of thought which thought that the only folk music America had, other than remnants of foreign language stuff, worth preserving, was that which came directly out of the Anglo-Saxon tradition. You had all the studies of the old British ballads and all that kind of stuff. And Lomax was just about the first to say, hey, we've developed a new folk music here, and it's coming out of black workers and people in the farms and the jails and cowboys and, and all that kind of stuff. And prior to Lomax, very few people collected that stuff. So that's a revival of a sort, which, in the sense that it dug up the stuff and went beyond the Academy. Then in the 20s and 30s, you had a bit more of a revival. Carl Sandburg began to sing some of the old folk songs. And then you had Henry Ford popularizing square dancing in the mid-30s. And you had some composers coming along. Aaron Copland, Ellie Siegmeister, the people who were drawing upon the folk tradition and incorporating them into. So that's a form of revival. And then, as I say, I think there was a kind of evolvement, just bringing Leadbelly into New York, bringing Woody Guthrie. Well, nobody brought him anyway. He came himself.
Yeah.
But sort of people shepherding him around the best they could. People like that. They got a hearing, and there was an interaction between these folks and what Alan Lomax called city billies. Okay, so you had that kind of. Of course, to Alan, the first city billy was Pete Seeger. Sort of the best synthesis of that process was Pete Seeger. And then you had the almanac singers, people's songs, people's art to sing out, that whole lineage. Because one of the things that happened, even though we started out basically as a political song magazine, sing out and people's songs, bulletin for it, by the early 50s, 52, 53, in McCarthyism, it was such a frigid era. There were very few new songs being written. And most of them that were being written were awful, because there was no mass audience. There were no big occasions where new songs were going to be introduced. So there was a real famine for about 5 years. I mean, there were a couple of lonely voices like Malvina Reynolds, and Pete was always doing something. But it was few and far between. So we became the folk song magazine.
I would say one of the questions I had for you was if you felt that Sing Out evolved somewhat away from its roots of the people's song bulletins. I think you've just sort of addressed that a little
Well,
bit.
it did, but I
Yes,
think
explicitly.
I think that process began while I was there. It's not like people came along. I mean, it was a.
Oh, I think it definitely did begin when you were there. I think
But
began-
it was always a contradiction, because I was always trying my best to keep that old purpose alive, and yet the other thing was impinging upon it. It wasn't a bad thing, but so it was a process there. By the 60s, it was a source of conflict right among the editors of Sing Out.
How overtly political are we to be? Is that
Yeah, I mean,
Were people wanting to go more commercial and get away from
no, it wasn't commercial. The conflict was, between traditional and political. Among the editors, John Cohen was always fighting with me about that stuff. Do you know John? Have you met him?
I've talked to him, and he's coming here, and we want to try and pin him down for talking.
He has a film that he's
At the
Oh, yeah.
Peru.
Yeah.
He's Peruvian, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, John's cause is traditional music. He and Mike especially, that's their cause. And by that time there was no real separating one from the other, but I remember a couple of incidents in which John felt very strongly that sing out was an embarrassment to him when he worked with country musicians. That there was, all this leftist stuff in there and so on. In fact, in 1965, Barbara and I organized the first big anti-war concert. It's called Singing for Peace at Carnegie Hall. Big event. And we invited all the folk singers we could, everybody make an appearance. And we sent out invitations all across the board, including to some of the traditional singers. Well, John was furious with us, absolutely livid, saying, do you know what, if you're going to write to, what's his name, Roscoe Holcomb down there in Kentucky, and he's going to get a letter from New York, and all his neighbors are going to want to know what it says, and if it says something about the Vietnam War, he's going to, you're going to put him in a very embarrassing position, and so on. And to me, this was a kind of paternalistic attitude, which objectified these folks and said, well, they were singers or rural people, but they weren't total human beings. I mean, the whole country was affected by the war. It wasn't just us folks up there in New York who were affected by the war. And a lot of them had opinions about it, one way or the other. And they could certainly say, I want to support this or I don't. And in fact, quite a number of people you wouldn't expect to come out and do these things, it turns out were against the war. But there was this real tug of war.
Did one faction or the other prevail at different periods of time? Did it go back and forth, or did the magazine kind of tumble through the middle?
I would say, no. I think my point of view prevailed until I got out of there.
Well, actually,
and that was a source of the friction.
Having read, all of the sing-outs from the 50s, most of them from the 60s, I would agree with you. I think the political message comes through, but it does seem to disappear in the middle of the 50s a little bit. Maybe
Yeah,
that's
there was just. I mean, it's there in some of the articles, but the songs aren't there. The songs aren't there.
What?
What I try to do is politicize, find a political angle. I shouldn't quite put it that way. I did some of the most interesting research during that time, so digging up suffrage songs and songs from the Revolution and things like that, which was a way of saying, hey, songs have always served a political purpose. It's not some invention of us latter-day leftists, and here are some of the living examples of it.
Do you think that Broadside, when it 62, so New York Broadside, did that fill a gap in your mind?
Yeah, I think it did, because there was such a proliferation of material. It was much more than we could handle. And by that time, we were sort of sectoralized, so there was a limited number of political songs we could publish because we had other kinds of obligations. And even at the height of things, 12 or 13 songs an issue probably was the average. Well, these songs were coming out much faster than we could possibly handle it, so Broadside was very logical. And by then, we were looked at, in relative terms, as sort of the institutionalized publication of the revival, and they were the young, up-and-coming, feisty ones.
Right, they were more suited to the mimeograph pages, actually. Kind of, even today, I think those mimeograph pages lend an aura to them.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good thing because it's a feeling of topicality. It's
Right.
If you don't do it now, it'll be gone, so you better grab it.
Yeah. Was there a point in time, and I'm referring, I'm talking about what's called the Great Folk Scare, the big commercial movement of folk music. Is there a point in time that you could sit here now and say, you said to yourself, post-Weavers really, efforts seem to die back a little bit, where you said something is going on.
Is there something happening?
Something is happening.
Oh, yeah.
What do you recall about that? What's your...
Well, I began to feel that in 1955, and it, more and more by 1959, it was fairly apparent.
Okay.
But I think when the Weavers reassembled and had a big successful concert,
56, the
it
first
was
Christmas
55 or
Eve concert?
56, yeah. And then it came out as a record.
Right.
That was a sign that the political climate in the country was changing. And it coincided with a lot of other events. the Khrushchev coming to power in the Soviet Union, denunciation of Stalin, overt attempts at peaceful coexistence and so on, that kind of thing. That was part of the political plan. Then McCarthy had peaked and by that time was dead, I think, or died shortly thereafter. It was about, so that was one thing. And then the first Newport Folk Festival indicated that there was a sizable audience. Somebody had figured that out. And then Harry Belafonte had been doing popular stuff, and the recordings were coming out. One of the ways it hit me especially is in 1957, by 57, things were so difficult that I had to stop working to sing out and get a straight job and just, put it out at night and things like that. And I actually worked for about 6 months, 8 months as a copywriter for Avon Books, doing publicity and blurbs and that kind of stuff. Happened to be a time that coincided with me getting hauled before the Un-American Activities Committee, which has its own set of ironies. But that juxtaposition led me to make an important career change, because I realized, well, getting called before the Un-American Committee, even though I held on to my job, there was no future there for me. I wasn't going to go anywhere. So, noticing a lot of what was going on, I went to Moesh and I said, listen, do yourself a favor and give me a job, because things are really on the rise. There's a lot happening that's much more than you can handle. And he knew it and hired me right away. And so this was in the summer of 1958. I went to work for Folkways, and just at that same time, it coincided with the whole thing taking off. You could see it in the sales of Folkways records and all of the various activities that we get involved with.
What did you do for Moon? I'm sorry. Same thing. What did you do for Moon?
A little bit of everything.
Okay.
I did all of the promotional and publicity work, produced all of the booklets, wrote or edited all the copy and put them together, and supervised their production and paste up, dealt with all of the suppliers, traveled and put on exhibits at conferences, educational exhibits, that kind of thing. And part of the deal of going there was that we'd continue putting out Sing Out. So that's when Sing Out was transformed from being a kind of a collective of an organization, because Mo made a proposal. This was all a condition of my employment. We worked it all out very carefully. That he would become a partner in Sing Out. And he would own 45% of it, and I would own 45% of it. And Pete Seeger would own 10%. He'd be the honest broker. So to make sure that everybody, nobody took undue advantage or whatever. Anyway, that was the arrangement. And then spinning off that, we started our publications, and that's when Sing Out began to take off, relatively speaking, in a commercial way.
So did you notice in subscriptions, or you were selling more and more copies of it? I mean, did you see that now all of a sudden people are interested in folk music and therefore they were buying Sing Out?
The thing that struck me the first was, I think it was either 59 or 60. We had kept a huge supply of back numbers of Sing Out, and we were selling them. And all of a sudden we began to run out. So I said to Mo one day, why don't we put out a little booklet of reprints from the issues of songs that were in issues that are now out of print. And it was very practical. People were writing in and said they wanted this song. And we didn't have it. So I said, we got enough of them. So he said, okay, let's do that. And I put the first one together. And put out 3,000 of them. And we sold them in a month. So there's a lot of people out there want this stuff. And then you could see from that, we went back to press with it, 5,000 in the second printing, sold out again very quickly. So then I said, we better do volume 2. But I mean, that also is a sign of this, whole thing bubbling over.
Yeah, that's a very important.
Back up just a little bit. I'm interested in you talked about the ownership. Now, the early Sing Outs all refer on the cover, I believe, to a People's Artist publication or something like
Right.
that. At some point in the 50s, that stops.
Right.
What happens? What was the original ownership, and how did it change?
Well, People's Artists It's all very, you got to go back to People's Songs.
Okay.
So People's Songs folded in 1949. We ran this big concert to bail us out of debt. Didn't work. It was inevitable. It was a sign of the times, but because the whole political base of People's Songs had folded with the Wallace campaign and the red baiting and all that kind of stuff. So we decided, okay, let's try to keep something going. People's Artists already existed as a booking agency adjunct to People's Songs. So we said, okay, instead of going out and forming a new corporation, we got one. Let's call it People's Artists. And it can do booking, but it will do more than that. So we regrouped a number of the people associated with People's Songs. It took us about a year, and then some other folks, and launched it more or less, and it existed for a year before we even put out Sing Out. And during that year, it was largely a booking agency, but it also produced the famous Peekskill concerts. And we'd get called in by different left-wing organizations to stage a program of some kind. And we're making plans to launch the magazine. So that was the entity which became the overall umbrella for whatever activities we undertook. I don't remember the details of who exactly it was. It was mostly myself, Betty Sanders, and Pete. Ernie, I don't know if he was like sort of the board, but Ernie was the editor of Sing Out for a short time, and was active there until he left New York. He left New York around 51 or 52, something like that. But there were, a handful of us, and sort of we were the ones who ran things. And Pete always kept his hand in. By 56 or 57, see, with the end of McCarthyism, the need for a booking agency vanished. Because it was a booking agency for blacklisted artists. Basically is what it came down to. And it wasn't just folk singers and political singers. We booked a lot of blacklisted actors. We got jobs from Morris Konofsky and Howard the Silver and people like that. We do anything that anybody wanted. We try and get talent for them. But there was no need for it after a while. By 56 or 57, that was a sign of the end of McCarthyism. And there was, just very few people still around who wanted to keep it up. So we decided to fold People's Artists and just keep putting out Sing Out. And I was the one who was mostly interested in that. And Ed Bedeau was sort of my sidekick. And between the two of us, we put it out for a couple of years. And when we hooked up with Mo, Ed also got a job working at Folkways after a while.
And where did ownership, I assume that previously it was owned by the corporation. Did ownership change then? Did you guys become the stockholders? That was it?
There was no such thing. It was just, nobody cared. So, we owned it. We were putting it out, and nobody said no. And if we didn't put it out, it wouldn't come out. Nobody was clamoring to get hold of this fortune-making machine,
That you'd work into the night, I'm sure, to get out.
Well, I had to. I was just working on something else during the day.
Well, something else that happened during the time frame you talked about when you went to work for Mo Ash. I'm wondering, what was your reaction? What was your first reaction to Tom Dooley and Kingston Trio? It must have been 50, I think it was November 57 or thereabouts.
I don't know. I blew hot and cold.
Okay. I don't know if it's possible to get an honest answer from anybody nowadays who's lived through it, but...
Well, there were days I would wake up furious, and other days where it's like, hey, it's like King Canute in the ocean. You can't stop this, so what are you knocking yourself out about? And it has a good side. This stuff is growing and proliferating and so on. It depended on the day. If I was broke, I would be sore as hell. All of us were sort of the original miners in this field, and we were having a hard time, and these Johnny-come-latelys come along, and they grab the money. That was one attitude.
Yeah.
But, I'm a realist, and there's no point in sustaining that. I got pissed the first couple of times. The Weavers monkeyed around with the songs and, watered them down in order to get them popular. But then after a while, you say, well, what the hell? The songs still live. You don't like the way the Weavers do it? Go out and do it your own way. Nobody's going to stop you, and we can keep that tradition alive. So, as I said, I had mixed feelings about it. I didn't enjoy the Kingston Trio. I wouldn't go to hear them at a concert. It just bored me. it was, partly it was an age thing. To me, they were sophomoric. And it wasn't just that they were slick. I'm not particularly against slick in and of itself, except if it replaces substance. But, so I wasn't an enthusiast, but I had to recognize that they were helping to create a climate that probably was better for all of us.
Did it bring about a discernible change in the climate? Because that is looked upon often as the turning point in the big commercial wave that was to follow in the 60s, or a lot of people describe it that way. Did you perceive it as that? Even looking, and fairly looking backward, did that mark a turning point?
Well, to the extent that somebody has to be first, yes. But it was going to happen. And it was only a matter of who was going to be the ones of the group that would provide it. Originally, it looked like it would be the Weavers that would do it. But they couldn't, and then it was too late. And so the Kingston Trio came along, and they grabbed it. I mean, there were a few others who were trying. There was the, what you would call the group, the Gateway Singers out here, that Lou Gottlieb was with, and then actually Barbara Dane was part of the original Gateway Singers. Oh. Would you do me a favor?
Sure.
There's a phone on the windowsill in the dining room. By the time I get to it, it's going to stop ringing.
Thanks, great.
Yeah, keep going. So I don't know where we were.
No, we were talking about the Kingston Trio,
Oh.
and whether that was it.
Yeah.
Let me
Well,
ask-
anyway, I more or less said what I had to say.
Well, let me, this brings up something that I've become curious about. You grew up in New York City? Is it? Okay, so what was your... I would imagine that the folk music you first heard was city guys singing folk music as opposed to traditional music. Is that correct?
Well, there weren't too many city guys singing it.
Okay, where'd you pick up your...
Commie camp.
Okay.
Did you go?
That's-
You're part of Commie Camp too?
I call it camp mommy is a commie. That's what I call it. We neither of us got sent to commie camp, but I always call it camp mommy's a commie.
No, this was Camp Ochica.
Which,
Have you heard of it?
oh yeah. We've talked to people who've gone. I remember it.
Well, I started going there at Camp Ochica in 1937. So this is way back when it was almost right at the beginning of getting started. And that was a very important part of my life because I went there as a kid and then I was a counselor there for 4 years. I never went into the Army because I got bad eyes. So I spent the war year, my summer war years, working as a counselor at Camp Ochica. So that was a big part of getting me drawn to this stuff. Because, first of all, camps in general, they like folk singing and simple songs and square dancing and folk dancing, so that's part of that. But then there were a number of people who were quite literate in this stuff. So that's how I got introduced to Lead Belly and Woody Guthrie and people like that via recordings. But then, because of the political side, not just the camp stuff, because I got older, I got active in student politics and all that, even at the age of 15 and 16. That's more or less when I ran across the Almanac Singers. So there was a whole process that was going on in which my association with folk music was largely in a political context, but at the same time, it was one that had a great deal of respect for the traditional side of it as well as for what one might call the more utilitarian side of giving it a political purpose.
Well, I wouldn't have thought that too many real traditional singers would be showing up at commie camp. Wasn't your exposure there through more of an educated urban group of people who were interpreters?
Yeah, but I don't even remember singers. Among the kids at camp, they began to sing.
So it's just songs that people would sing, in other words, they'd introduce, the counselor would introduce a song.
Yeah, the music counselor would know that. But by then, the influences were secondhand. I mean, the Almanac Singers affected all of us who were on the left and interested in this folk music, and they were the only ones, really. But they also aroused our curiosity about the more authentic people. So Well, I heard Woody before the war.
Let me ask you, who in the 40s, other than Woody and Leadbelly and Nick Bill Brunzi, I mean, who were you exposed to in the early 40s who had some ties to traditional performers and traditional folk cultures, other than the three I mentioned? Who was around?
Think
Sonny
back.
Carey, perhaps?
Yeah, well, Sonny, of course. Both Sonny and Brownie were spirituals for swing. But I was still pretty young and not traveling. I didn't have much money. I wasn't going off to concerts and things like that.
Right.
So a lot of it was secondhand. It's hard to say because I was more like the climate in which I was functioning. I mean, they were well-known. See, here we focus on folk music. But at the time, that was not a separate entity to me. That was one part of a totality of culture in which I was immersed. For instance, working at this camp, when I first met, I don't know if you ever heard of Pearl Primus, wonderful modern dancer. Yeah, fantastic modern dancer. I got introduced to modern dance, and I actually danced with her a couple of times. I got introduced to famous black artists, Jacob Lawrence and Charles White, who were both counselors at Camp OG. I became very good friends with them. So there was a cultural process taking place that by no means was confined to folk music or folk art, and that was not the prism through which I looked at culture. I was an avid reader of the most modern novels. I listened to jazz and modern art. I mean, all kinds of things. It was not just folk music.
Was there a point in the 60s folk scare? I asked if there was a time where the light clicked on and you said, something is happening here. Was there a time when you said, this has all gone too far? This is all bullshit. This is all tiresome, crass, commercial crap, and something has happened, and it's gone wrong, it's gone astray?
Yeah, in a way. I've given that a lot of thought. Because part of it, I think, is true, and part of it was a narrowness of vision on my part. That has to be sorted out. I think, to a certain extent, how old are you guys?
I'm 39.
Okay, so you didn't live through the war, and you was there. It's hard to describe the emotional impact of the war in Vietnam on those of us who threw ourselves into that like the second coming of Christ or something. But we became extremely impatient with anybody we knew for whom that was not the most urgent topic of conversation and participation. And not just the war in Vietnam, but that was sort of the centerpiece by then. And I guess by 1965, 66, I was beginning to feel a growing dichotomy between the folk revival and what I thought the original political impulse was behind at least that aspect of the folk revival that had drawn me into the process. And more particularly, Sing Out, for which I took responsibility. It wasn't just the commercial side of it. It was also what I felt was an uncritical worship of tradition. I got into some big fights with folks about that. In fact, when I finally broke up with Sing Out, after I left, I was still writing for a while. I wrote a column, this must have been like 68 or 69. I was still doing my column, called No More Traditions Chains Shall Bind Us, which is a line from the International. It just, Sing Out had decided to put out a bumper sticker which said, sing a traditional song. And it just infuriated me. And I said, what do you mean, any traditional song? I said, Dixie is a traditional song. You want to promote singing songs of the Confederacy? Or, where's the judgment coming? I mean, one may preserve that stuff, that's fine. But you're not talking about people. Come on, have a good time. And in tradition, you've got some of the most backward ideas imaginable. And it's just as well to consign them to history and not take on the responsibility for perpetuating them. So remember that one may preserve tradition, but there's also always a struggle against tradition. The uncritical acceptance of tradition and the need to break with tradition in order to create something new. So to the extent that that other process was going on, it was beautiful and valuable. I mean, some of these traditional singers and musicians, it's gorgeous stuff, just blow your mind. But it wasn't the be-all and end-all of what this was all about, and for a growing number of people it was. I mean, there were people by then who were beginning to lead a folk life, big-time quotation marks. Okay, but I mean, and they knew they weren't, but in a sense it was sort of the beginning of the reaction against the nature of the 60s, even though it happened in the 60s. The withdrawal into smaller cultural enclaves that would wall you off from all of the turmoil in the larger society. And I remember going to folk festivals at that time that had that feeling to them. Saying, no, this is not what I thought it was about. And, in a way you say, yes, go on and do it and be happy, but you could feel the pull of this on the whole thing. The commercial stuff actually bothered me less.
I was just going to say, it sounded like the commercial stuff bothered you less than this unswerving devotion to tradition for its own sake. Is that fair, what you're saying?
Yeah. I mean, there was the naked, brutal, overtly capitalist side of the commercial thing was terrible to see. I mean, you could go to the Newport Folk Festival and you could sit out front and listen to everything, and you had this great potpourri of stuff. But if you were around backstage and saw the managers fighting with each other about who's going to be in what spot on the program, and the wheeling and the dealing and the negotiating, and who had the clout and who didn't, because what's his name was Bob Dylan's manager, and somebody else was Joan Baez's manager, and so on. And these were terrible struggles that were going on. That's commercialization. It's not just what the Kingston Trio does when they get up on the stage. It's all of this other stuff that goes on behind the scenes, but that's the lifeblood of the thing. That's very repelling also. So, but the breaking point came it had been building up. When I went to Cuba in 1966, and Barbara and I were among the first people to visit Cuba, we were there. The first time I ever met any Vietnamese people. We went to the embassy of the Vietnamese in Cuba, the National Liberation Front, as well as the North Vietnamese. I mean, it can't, for people in our position, it has an overwhelming emotional impact. And I, became increasingly impatient with anybody who, in my opinion, wasn't doing enough. Okay, so the sectarian view, of course, but nevertheless, that was the nature of the period. So when I came back, I did this article about Cuban music and so on. I'm sure there were very few readers of Sing Out who were really interested in that. But, I was determined to do that kind of stuff. And I was always the one digging up songs of Delano or, which you'll find in, I was the one who was digging for that offbeat stuff that was in a folk tradition but happened so overtly political. The 1967 Newport Folk Festival was really where the shit hit the fan in earnest. At least for me. I mean, something snapped inside my brain because it coincided with the riots in Newark, or as we chose to call them, the urban rebellions in Newark. And the Newark uprising or riot or whatever you call it was among the bloodiest and the longest, and it was one of the landmarks of that whole process. And it was at a point where our ability to influence the policy of the government vis-a-vis Vietnam seemed to, the worse things got, the less influence we seemed to have, even though, I couldn't imagine this war ever coming to an end. And so the Newport Folk Festival that year was sort of oblivious. There was an occasional song about Vietnam and an occasional civil rights song, but the disjuncture between what was going on outside of Newport and what was going on inside of Newport at least to me, was so great that I couldn't stand it. I mean, literally something snapped. I wrote this big piece in Sing Out, which infuriated Pete, and he wrote me a terrible letter at some point wanting to know if I had signed up to be with the CIA, because he had some illusion about what Newport was, and I was trying to undermine it. And he felt. I mean, but that was, it was a difficult time. But it was at that point that I sort of decided I had to be done with all this. And, I was also somewhat in the commercial side of it, because we had this book publishing company. I mean, yeah, and I made a good living off it. Because we had been in on the ground floor of the folk revival when it came to books, so it was, a very successful company.
Who are your partners?
Moash. Just me and Moash. So I had to be done with all this. And it added to another frustration. It's just a long-standing personal frustration. I'm not a musician. And I had spent 20 years of my life helping organize the activities of other creative people. And I said, but I got my own work to do. That's enough. I'm tired of making it possible for other people to do things. And I'd always been a journalist, and musical journalism was not the only thing I had ever worked at. I did all kinds of things journalistically. Been a sports writer, and God knows what. I worked for Trade Public. I'm a professional journalist, and a good one. So I said, I got to be done with this. And that's when I left Sing Out, sold Oak Publications, made a complete break, and went to work for the Guardian.
You said Pete had a view of what Newport should be. Was it a forum for traditional music?
Not so much.
What was that view?
Well, it's best to ask Pete, and I'm sure you will. But my understanding, I think that the most continuous thread I get from Pete's conceptions, and they change to a certain extent because he's somebody with a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of ideas, is the idea of homemade music. I think that's the continuity. Which includes traditional, but is not just traditional, and does not exclude professional artists, but who work out of a tradition where it's clearly homemade. To me, that was, one can respect it, but I think it's too narrow. In the age of advanced technology, his conception of homemade music tended to be somewhat anti-technological. And obviously that's a kind of cultural Ludditism or something that it won't stand up.
And with Pete, I don't think it'll go away.
Well, probably not, but I think he's grown more tolerant of the others. He has to, I guess.
It's interesting because I don't know, certainly by '68, Newport was presenting what we look back on now and call rock acts. I mean, Janis Joplin and Country Joe, and Country Joe, more than Joplin, came out of a tradition of singing Woody songs, but I think, I don't know if it was '67, but it seems putting the Fish on stage and Janis Joplin with her blues band is inconsistent also in a different way with Pete's concept of Newport.
Yeah, I think, well...
And that was certainly happening by the late '60s.
Yeah, but that was not happening by '67. I mean, the biggest impact
68, 69,
was the
yeah.
way people described Dylan going electric, okay?
Right.
And people really misunderstood. There was a lot of reaction against him going electric, or at least that being presented on the Newport stage.
Right, that was
And that Pete may have had that reaction. That didn't bother me. My problem with what Dylan was doing was that he was moving away from that set of political poetry and poetic politics that distinguished him so much in the early '60s, and which I felt it was a shame that he was leaving behind. Okay, that's what he chose to do. But it was a loss, because he really influenced a whole generation of people to raise the poetic standards of political and topical songs and really make it into art. He was a great artist. So he went on to what he felt was better. But to me, that was a loss.
Let's go back to that now. I wanted to not get away from the emergence of the topical songwriters of the 60s. So let's talk a little bit about Dylan, for instance. What's your first memory of hearing him? And if it was early, that wouldn't have even been included in the songs, probably. But do you have a memory of first being exposed to him?
I don't think it was that early. It was maybe 62, 63.
Okay.
The first time he was on the Hootenanny was in 1963.
The Broadside Move, or?
No, Sing Out
Sing Out
the
Move,
Hootenanny.
okay.
We did it at Carnegie Hall, China. And I think that was the first time I met him. I mean, you know, before the program was on, we all got together and so on. And, you know, I'd heard his first record, and then, you know, the songs were coming out,
Right.
and they blew me away. I mean, to me, these were just... This was the next generation, or next and after that generation, of what I felt I had started out with. So to me, that was what he represented was fantastic, because it was overtly political, but it wasn't just you know, simple sing-along and that kind of stuff. It was really terrific, and you know, it had a fantastic impact. So I was less interested in his imitations of Woody Guthrie than but that was part of his development. But when he struck out on his own, and I remember some friends of mine, my generation, who I said, "Hey, you got to come to this program and hear this guy." Didn't like him at all. And my then wife said, "He can't even sing," which
Can I
was
ask how old
not
you
an
are?
uncommon reaction. I'm 67.
Okay, I want to get a sense of how old you were in 62 and 63 when you first hear Dylan. So, okay.
I was 38.
Yeah, right.
So, but he can't. She was a trained concert singer. So I said, well, you know, that's not the way one defines singing. You know, you may say a person is not a concert singer, but he's obviously, if singing, like any other art form, is basically communication. You can't tell me this guy isn't communicating and arousing emotions in his audience. So, I mean, what standard do you hold out accountable to?
Did you ever get to know him at all?
Not really.
Did you know Oakes or Paxton? Those are the other two names that survived really strong.
Well, we were a different generation. I mean, I knew them all, of course.
Yeah.
And I had plenty of run-ins with Phil Oakes, who I thought was very snotty. But, I mean, he had an inferiority complex. He was always wanted to be Bob Dylan. And what he did was good in its own right, but it wasn't going to be Bob Dylan. And, you know, at some point he was resigned to it, but, or maybe he never was completely resigned to it. And the one real stupid incident I had with Phil Oakes was when he wrote his song about Mississippi. And, you know, ran into him in the street down in the village, and he said, "Oh, you just wrote this song. I'd like to hear it." And I said, "Yeah." I went up to his place. And he sang it to me. And I said, "Well, it's really good." He said, "But, you know, I think there's a bit of a political problem with this song, because your solution is to tell Mississippi to get the hell out of the United States. A third of the population of Mississippi is black. So maybe you should think about a better way of making your statement." But he was furious. I didn't even say this in public or anything. It was just he and I sitting there in his room. He was furious because he didn't want criticism. He wanted me to tell him how wonderful it was. And he publicly attacked me for it at his next program at Town Hall.
For that?
By name.
Really?
Well, he
Irwin
didn't.
Silber thinks this is.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was stupid. He wrote a lot of very good topical songs, and especially in terms of the war, they were very effective and very useful. You know, see, part of the problem of the '60s is that everybody was on their own. I mean, I grew up in a time when you were in organizations, you were in movements, you had collectives, to use a tired word. But I mean, it was real. It wasn't just an abstraction. That you did things together, you planned things together. but everybody was on their own. And it was career oriented. Inevitably, they couldn't help
Well,
themselves.
the money started happening too.
Well,
There's all of a sudden there was money.
Of course.
made. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation, and it ties into something that who said it to us? Archie Green. You probably disagree with about a lot of things.
Well, I'm a good friend of Archie Green's.
What he said to us is that, he was referring to you, I think, and Pete. He said that these guys, referring to Dylan, Oakes, Paxton, and the 60s topical songwriters, he said they did not have to, how did he phrase it? He said they could walk into a ready-made political folk song context with the way paved for them by people who've been sung for years and years and years and years. And I think that ties into the comment you just made
Right.
about they didn't have to do political work, for instance, unless they wanted to do it to foster their careers as entertainers or to make a splash. They were simply
Well, they were
people
doing
who were
that.
entertainers first, and I think that's probably true.
But, I mean, look, that was true earlier as well. Not everybody was a Pete Seeger who took organizational responsibilities. There were plenty of musicians who worked as musicians. Of course, they were left-wingers and could hardly make careers out of it. But they would come and perform and do their thing and so on, and they didn't do much more. I mean, Freddie Hellman was around those days, and everybody always used to bitch about Freddie because he didn't do anything but show up and sing, but okay. But it was not, what I'm saying is that there was a certain degree of accountability, so that even if you resisted it, you knew you were resisting it, that other people were holding you accountable to certain standards or ideas or commitments or whatever the case might be. And that was sort of a value of the time. But that was not the case in the 60s. And it's not their fault. But it's, takes some adjusting on my part because I'm used to that and still hold myself accountable. Even though I've long since left the Communist Party, but I'm always part of some kind of an organizational thing. But not, there's no way. That's like my encounter with Phil Oakes. To me, in the old days, that would be a friendly discussion about how one person helps another one, give them some ideas that may help them improve something they're working on. They can take it or leave it as they see fit, but it would be looked at that way. That's why I was just thrown for a loop by Phil's reaction. But I pondered it for a long time. And I finally began to realize that, this was what was involved.
Did you get out much into the clubs and the Gaslight and the Village and Gertie's?
Some.
Again, you were older, I guess. You don't get out anymore either.
Well, some. I mean, Gertie's was not the same as the others, because that was much more.
The showcase.
But it was also Izzy Young's little number, and it was a place where you could, Mike Porco who ran it, I mean, you could hang out there, and there were quiet nights, and you just sit around and bullshit. You don't quite do that at some of those other clubs, because they got bigger nuts, and they're paying their performers a lot more money and so on. So occasionally I'd go to, the Village Gate or the Gaslight when there was something I wanted to hear. But Gertie's, it'd be more a place you might drop in on. But no, I mean, I did a lot of traveling and was very much consumed with stuff around the war. And I had a family, I had 3 small kids and all that kind of stuff. So, I wasn't club hopping all the time, no.
Oh, I understand.
I should think so.
We have a 2-year-old, and we don't club out too much anymore either.
I would think not.
I wanted to know a little bit, I just want to talk, I wanted to know a little bit more about what fascinates me is the money, all of a sudden the money making that starts happening. Whereas I think 40s, 50s, people weren't making a lot of money, and all of a sudden the 60s.
For a brief period, the Weavers did. But, no, I should amend that. The money kept on because of copyrights. So a lot of those songs became immensely popular, and even when they were blacklisted, other people were doing them. So for the Weavers and the people in business with the Weavers, that the money became a big factor.
And then in the 60s, I mean, because then you get all this, commercialization, but you get the Hootenanny magazine that came out for a few issues, and you get the Hootenanny television show, and people just starting to try to make money off of it.
It really seemed that money came along as it never had before in something that was called folk music.
Well, the impact of money on what was called folk music was qualitatively different than anything that had ever happened before, for sure. And it can't help but have a distorting effect on the music. It just can't help it. I mean, it's there. And one starts out by saying, well, all they want me to do is what I'm doing anyway, only they're going to pay me for it. What's wrong with that? And who can argue with somebody trying to make a living and accepting it? But, then the process is underway. And I'm not one for saying people sold out or anything like that. To me, you live in a capitalist society. That's the way it works. And in my own small way, I became a capitalist for a few years. And to me, that's not a judgmental thing. That's just an objective description of the way I made a living. But then you have to judge people by, well, what actually are you doing?
Was that very popular then in this?
Well, it's all relative. I think at the height of its circulation it was around 25,000. So that's very modest as magazines go. And it was not a money-making proposition. It only, it got by as an adjunct to Oak Publications. Oak Publications was a very successful publishing business. And one of the reasons successful because when we started out, I did everything myself. And then only as it became too much, you'd hire somebody, okay, you take care of this. But I knew every aspect of the business. I mean, that's what happens with a small business. You start out, one guy runs a little drugstore, and then, 50 years later, it's Wayland's or something.
Right.
Who'd you sell it to? Around
An outfit called Music Sales. They were an offshoot. Well, it was a company that had been around a long time. There were two young guys who were sort of running it on behalf of their father, and they were going to inherit it. And they were very hip to all the latest trends, and they were interested in the folk music stuff. I had edited a couple of books for them on my own, the kind of stuff that we probably wouldn't publish in Oak. So just general music anthologies. And they were very impressed. They had approached me at some point and said, well, if you're ever interested in selling, we're the ones who would like to buy it. And the instruction books and things like that. Those were the best-selling books that we did. So when I decided that I wanted to get out of this, I went to them and jumped at it.
There's a lot of you see occasionally songbooks and things in used bookstores. Does a collection of that stuff survive anywhere, as far as you know?
Of what stuff?
Oh, you put out lots and lots of songbooks which have descriptions of the artists and what have you, didn't you?
I mean, me personally?
Well, Oak, didn't Oak put
Oak?
Yeah.
Well, I've got most of the Oak books
Oh,
here.
you really?
I don't think I have a complete set. But I've got...
I mean, what did they do with it once they bought it? Just...
Well, they got a wonderful deal because I was anxious to sell.
You want it out.
Obviously, the stuff was not in print any longer, and people lost
Yeah.
interest in
When,
stuff.
no, but what they did was, one, they bought an inventory, and then they could see what was selling and what wasn't. So that when slow-selling books went out of print, they just didn't put them back into print.